We're going to go ahead and start with Nishan. Your background is not, in fact, in the tech industry. You've come to it somewhat more recently. Tell us a little bit about where you've come from and what that perspective has brought to CEDAT and what you're trying to do there.
Yeah, so I suppose, yeah, I'm not a traditional technologist, I suppose, by any sense of the imagination. My background, I started off with my bachelor's in computing, computer science. But then I went into military and policing and intelligence work. So a lot of that from the operational side of things went into digital intelligence and profiling and forensics and whatnot. So I kind of saw the darker side of the technological world, so to speak. On one hand, you think law enforcement, so that's a good thing. But as we all know from the likes of the Great Hack and the Edward Snowden kind of leaks and some of the methodology and some of the kind of frameworks that have been used to kind of utilize data and profile is not so savory, let's say. So that was kind of the footing of how I was kind of in this kind of world. And as time went on, I thought that actually my conscience started kind of playing a key into how I wanted to do things, and it didn't really sit right with me. So I went to go back into academia and did my master's in cybersecurity. And then from there, going into some further research around big data analytics and profiling. And after getting my fellowship with the RSA in London and some other various memberships and whatnot, I found myself in IEEE, actually kind of exploring the space around the P7000 series of AI and ethical kind of design and guidelines. And that's actually where I met Meeri, who at that point had the budding startup that is Sidot.ai. And we got into some very, very interesting conversations about our various sides of AI and how it's utilized in the industry, both private sector, public sector. And yeah, I jumped on board to head up R&I to kind of try and really find a way that we can work with businesses, with public sector, with any kind of agency to find a way to kind of I guess, utilize AI appropriately, transparently, effectively, and by consent, I guess, which is really very much the theme with MyData here, utilizing personal data by consent.
So Alessandro talked about some of the concerns around AI, around ethics and human rights, but you have a somewhat different background. Are there other issues that we haven't raised so far that we should also be afraid of? Is it killer robots, or are there some more mundane security and defense issues we should be thinking about?
Yeah, so I think with cybersecurity, when people hear cybersecurity, they think straight away of network security, hacking, and those very kind of traditional concepts. But for me, I think it's not killer robots. For me, it's data misuse, let's say, and profiling. The amount of data points, again, I don't want to keep referring to the Great Hack there, but it's a good illustration to show just the number of data points that are collected on individuals and how they're used and why they're used. For me, that's the biggest point. I think with regulation and law, in an ideal world, regulation and law is used perhaps to highlight best practice. Realistically, I think, especially in a law enforcement context, let's say, it's almost, you're trying to find a way to break the system. Where are the loopholes? How can I actually achieve my objective without kind of tripping over these tripwires of legislation? So I think that, to me, is the danger, especially as when all of these data points that are out there that exist that are constantly being collated by various agencies and organizations, and the framework is far behind the actual usage. So until that kind of catches up, it's very much this wild west of how are people using my data, what are they going to do with it, how is it going to affect my everyday life. We can use real-life examples of the dystopian kind of countries out there that very much have this top-down methodology and regulate people's lives compared to what I like to see in Finland, where perhaps is a bit more progressive and it's almost not just bottom up, but there's this general kind of conversation around how we should be using data and these mechanisms that utilize our data.
So Meeri, everyone's been setting the stage for you, and now all eyes are on you, right? Everyone said companies have to do this. This is something that we have to figure out. How have you figured it out? What does CEDAT do?
Okay, I need to comment one thing before I answer to that. This diversity is like, having worked a couple of years quite solely on this AI ethics space, it has been tremendously exciting to work with people from so many different backgrounds, and like Nishan's background was like a wonderful addition to our team. But this is now related to these like key concerns, and why we worry about this technology is that actually we're talking about human rights and fundamental rights and like freedoms and equality as the topics, and this way of like involving different people from different backgrounds is the single most important tool for addressing that one. So that's fascinating in all this discussion. But yeah, that was the reason we founded Cydet 1 year ago. Basically, having been in discussion, I'm looking from the industry perspective heavily. I've been driving data and analytics use. I truly believe on the benefits of good use of data and AI. But how I saw it and still see it is that this is a very sort of inspiring and interesting topic for people who are like working with data in the teams. I've faced so many people and data science teams in companies who think that, okay, it's wonderful that this topic is on table, and it's been something that people have thought in teams and like in their own heads, but there hasn't been room for actually acting on this because we are driven by the short-term targets in the company. So seeing and being part of setting these principles in different levels and working that one, I got very frustrated on the fact that there is no means on actually acting on it, or we can do the culture change, but I had a feeling that like we need something more tangible for actually changing on a practical way and supporting the data science teams in the companies and in public sector organizations. So started to think what are those things that actually like help driving it into concrete level and acting on these manners, and that took me quite quickly into sort of focusing on two foundational principles that I feel like you can find from all those lists that Alessandra listed. In every one of those there is transparency and accountability as a principles. I haven't seen any of AI ethics principles without those. And we focused on those one, and the reason is basically why transparency is so important is that without transparency we don't have any means to evaluate any other ethics principles, the existence or non-existence of those. So that's what we wanted to focus on, and basically now we're developing technology platform to help companies and public organizations build the transparency, know what is the information we need to have in place for third parties, independent players to do the validation, understand how the system works, and then have the possibility to share that information with those parties who need to have that information. Not so that everything would be open for everyone, because that's not realistic. So we want to facilitate this creation of transparency, keeping it up to date, and sharing of that information.
And is anyone willing to pay for it?
Yeah, we have paying customers. so that's a good one. But yeah, actually, one concrete project that we're working at the moment, and what I really hope that will be a benchmark for like globally as well, and those are the discussions we are having. But we are working with Helsinki, Espoo, Ministry of Justice, Social Insurance Institute, Kela, and Sitra on basically finding a common way for Finnish public sector organizations. And this is actually something that it's really interesting, because public sector government activities are by default open in Finland. That's in the law. We have julkisuuslaki, the act of openness of government activities. So we're sort of building a standard way of interpreting that for the algorithmic systems that are used in the public sector, and the motivation there with these customers that we are working is to really be proactive in the transparency towards the citizens, promote also citizen agency so that citizens actually have possibilities to keep with the pace on on this algorithmic society, but also like seek for efficiency on addressing these questions, and that's really important. And demand for standards, and like whether it's like official standards or industry standards, common ways of working and agreeing of those. That's super important, and that's where we see really willingness from industry players to work together to find efficient ways of addressing on these ones.
For the private sector customers, what's the driver? Is it a question of they're facing demand from their customers to give transparency? Is it reputational? If I'm a big company doing something interesting with machine learning, what drives me to want to be your customer?
It's trust. Like, trust is essential for all businesses, but for some businesses it's even more important than others. So obviously we are focusing on those businesses and industries where trust is essential. But also, like in a very practical manner, like if you look at the forecast, I checked that Gartner predicts the business value created by AI will reach 3.9 trillion by 2020. And thinking about that expectation for the business value being created by AI, now we have, during the couple last years, we have raised on table a new risk for that business case. And that's also like a very powerful motivation to be like interested about these ones and like find a good ways for addressing this commercial risk for the AI business cases that companies have.
I just want to jump in quickly there as well, because when we talk about, I guess, certification and risk, and especially from, well, I guess my experience in the public sector as well, thinking of defense contractors or the intelligence community, that kind of thing, when they hear the word transparency, that's a very loaded kind of word in the sense, because you think there's some information that might need to be protected or held back. They might not necessarily be totally transparent as to how they do things or why they do things. So it's developing, it was also kind of, it was mentioned earlier about the specific sectors, about these niche kind of demands, and how we can actually work with specific sectors to utilize these frameworks or develop these methodologies to be able to enable or show that they are data or whatever it is being utilized in a trustworthy way without necessarily, you know, exposing any kind of secrets. I suppose it's kind of like a zero knowledge proof kind of methodology for anyone that knows that kind of side of cybersecurity. And that goes around to businesses as well, because straight away you start thinking about IP and IP protection in terms of their very, what they might see to be as proprietary algorithms and something that's very kind of business valuable. So they don't necessarily want to expose that. And sometimes I think the lack of transparency or the lack of wanting to be transparent is under the guise of we want to protect our trade secrets. So I think that's also the challenge as well, is to integrate with that and to actually work with companies to say that, you know, to harbor and facilitate this trust that is ever becoming more and more of a demand from consumers and customers and citizens, whilst maintaining a company's ability to trade and do business and to operate.
I think this is also, like many times this, when we talk in different conferences about transparency, there is always someone who brings up that this is against interests related to IP, and I think that's many times sort of false way of like putting transparency away from table. I haven't actually heard that worry from any of our customers or potential customers that I've been discussing. They're using different commercial platforms for running those algorithms, and like there are many different third parties involved in like and having already visibility into these systems. So that hasn't been an issue, and that's just like how do we manage. If we're talking on driving transparency so that everything is open for everyone, that's like obviously against the like any commercial interest of companies. But if you do it in a clever way so that information is shared to whom it belongs and who needs to have access into it.
So since we started talking transparency, how do we pull what you're doing back to the question of MyData? Because it's a bit like the question of the relationship between the open data and the MyData community. Where do we get to the point where a citizen exercises their MyData rights and has some understanding of how that effect was happening with regards to an automated or AI system that is processing their data and making a decision about them.
Okay, I think there is very clear integration point to MyData. MyData is about sharing, giving consents, and giving access to your data. But for what purposes? What are the uses that we are giving those accesses? So there is actually we have been discussing looking at these different MyData models, for example, Sitra's Ihan model, and I think there is a very clear point of actually, or that directory of the applications or the uses that we give consents to use our data. So we are sort of standardizing that metadata on those systems that will get access to use our data, and that's if a person wants to go deeper, understand how does the system operate. So there are different transparency on the system metadata that provides basically that possibility to really dive into how the system works.
Well, yeah, I mean, I was pretty much going to say exactly what Meeri said. Really, I think with the SIDOS platform specifically, it's that enabler. I mean, with the MyData kind of ethos methodology about having ownership of data and finding out who's using it and why, and having some level of control. I suppose with the current kind of systems where you might sign up for a particular agency or service and you allow them to use your data, and that's very much the end of it. At least what we aim to do with our platform is to give that level of, again, transparency to actually see, well, how is your data being used? What are they actually doing with it? What systems are in place within that kind of business's ecosystem that's actually utilizing your data and why? And that level of explanation is very much, I think, what brings it into what we're all here about to talk about.
So one last question for both of you before we go to our broader discussion. What's missing as a driver for you? Is there something that would really be a game changer in terms of demand? Is it a piece of regulation or legislation? Is it a mind shift? Is it maybe something around liability? What would be, you guys are clearly getting customers, but is there something that would really cause a quantum leap in the amount of demand for what you're doing?
Maybe I start commenting. Obviously, actually, I have to say that I've changed my mind all the time, more from driving self-regulation into being quite positive on the hard regulation. I think we need that as well. And actually, maybe commentary to Alessandra's speech that I also think it's very sort of industry specific, or we need to really consider it from that perspective. But I think a couple things that we can regulate across industries. Transparency is one thing, and we know already transparency is being regulated, or there's a lot of work on, for example, in the medical area for regulating the transparency. But then oversight is another important topic, and who are the parties who do oversight on the algorithmic system? That's obviously requires transparency. But what could be the so regulation definitely is something that impacts, and the areas where we see that it's closer. Regulation is close or quite close. That's obviously the areas where companies are more interested in this one. I also think that champions, good examples, that kind of players who think that, okay, this is important, this is going to happen, and we want to show example, not only in words, but actually living out the values and principles. Those have they are powerful, so that's why we are looking with SIDOT for these kind of partners who want to be champions in their industry and show example, and then take the rest of the industry together.
I think from my view, I think it's very much, the quick and easy answer will be all of the above, with everything that you said. But of course, traditionally speaking, it would be, you think of the kind of those key events that then trigger a reaction. So whether it is the Cambridge Analytica kind of situation, or whether it's going back to PRISM and the Edward Snowden kind of whistleblowing, and then suddenly there's this mass awakening of the real actual landscape and how things are doing, and then there's this driver for change. But of course, again, referring to our previous speakers, that I think just relying on top-down hard regulation, just relying on bottom-up, it works to a point, but all of these things need to be brought together, and that's one of the, I think for me, one of the exciting things about the MyData movement is that it's driving that. It's incorporating bodies like IEEE, it's bringing in businesses, lots of very people that are whether experienced in the sector or just very interesting, or someone like me who's just somehow landed here through the virtue of my experience. But I think all these different things, that's what needs to happen, this kind of engagement and kind of cyclical kind of process in order to drive it together. Otherwise, we end up in this time lag and kind of disjointed.
Well, I think you just sketched out what we can continue discussing, and I want to invite Ozan and Alessandro back onto the stage, and we can continue this conversation. So gentlemen, please. And what I want we're going to go to screen.io in a second, but first I want to give the four of you a chance. If any of you want to ask someone else from the group a question that you've been dying to ask, if Meeri, if you want to ask Alessandro, where we should start with the regulation or vice versa, now's a great chance to do that.
May I have
Please.
a comment? Yeah, I really appreciate two aspects. As a lawyer, that we discuss a lot about law rather than ethics. It means that law is still important. But I think that in your discussion, clearly emerged two different aspects. The first, that there is not a top-down idea of regulation. Regulation is more complicated and more flexible, if you want. And this is important also for company to be active, to be acting in the dialogue with regulators to suggest schemes, model, best practice, everything can contribute. And the second point that was interesting, that you focus on trust, and there is a lot of trust, the trustworthy framework on artificial intelligence of the European Union. But it's interesting that you don't talk about trustworthy artificial intelligence, because I have some concern about the use of trust. Because you talk of trust as a consequence of accountability and transparency. Unfortunately, trust can be also used as a manner to say, okay, you trust in me, you trust in my company, and so you give me your data to me, and that's all. So trust grounded on something that is based on evidence, you mentioned also the role of supervisory authority, is good trust. The bad trust is trust that you trust in the brand, you trust in the market, placement of the company, not in what is behind.
I fully agree on that one, and this validated trust is something that I want to be taking forwards. I've been even saying that, and that's need to be really careful when driving this kind of high-level discussions but the idea that if we only talk on a principle level, actually there was this interesting announcement by the largest companies in the US that the purpose of the business is not anymore only to create value for shareholders, but also impact well-being in the of the customers and employees and so forth. That's a very, very nice statement, but how does it turn into practice? So this is sort of the fear is, or the concern is that if we do these kind of promises and we don't act on those, actually the end result is worse than in the beginning, because we have created this false feeling of trust, and that's really dangerous. So that's the reason why we want to focus on this evidence, so that we have something to build on the trust.
I want to I want to highlight two questions here, which kind of aim in the same direction. So the first one is, who should be liable for damage caused by AI-based actions and decisions? The product owner, the coder, the operator of technology? And I'd start with Ozan and Meeri. But I think the second question kind of goes in the same direction and asks, how alone are the poor algorithm writers at the moment without this ethical guidance? So both of you, when you yourself build systems, you look at people building systems, do you think that part of the problem is that they would like to be doing something right, but they don't know where to start? Ozan, please.
Yeah, about the first question of who should be liable in case of an accident, a damage, or in an unwanted situation, let's say, should be the data scientist coding the AI algorithm, operator serving that, product owner, or government, because they didn't, who, really? So this is not strictly defined at all in pretty much in any industry, actually, meaning that this is a case-by-case discussion which we have lots of loopholes still, and which we are right now trying to fix depending on the industry, depending on the damage, and depending on what the user has unbeknownst to himself or herself or willingly accepted while using that service or product. Unfortunately, it's gray area.
Yeah, I agree. There is no one answer for this one, but it's a hot topic. And the bigger the risks and the problems caused by risks come, the more interesting it is for lawyers. And this is actually something, I don't know, like I'm interested to, if there are lawyers in the audience, I would be happy to hear, are you facing these questions? But I know in the US, it's more like much more lawyer-driven society, so they definitely are already investigating these cases, and yeah, how we are trying to address is basically through accountability agreement, so that we actually get visibility into the AI supply chain, who has been involved in which moment of like, and in which role in the creation of it. So, but we will see. I assume we will see a lot of development on this, and like a lot of new clauses in contracts between companies for this area.
But you're not seeing them yet.
Actually, we are collaborating, starting work on this area, and that comes from, and this is like, get ready for that one, public sector organizations who now start to think about this transparency. The next question is, how do we push these transparency requirements into the, like through our procurement requirements? So it's coming there, and like, yeah, vendors should prepare. And
I'll go to Alessandro in a second, but there's an interesting follow-up that was also asked, which is whether it's possible to insure your company against the cost of liability caused by AI, either now or should it be possible in the near future?
This is something that I don't think it is at the moment, because there is no basically possibility to calculate the risk level, or like there is not enough transparency. But this is something that we are also very interested to like see. I assume there will be insurances specifically for these when we have the necessary transparency that allows insurance companies also to actually do underwriting related to
and
this.
One small thing in this question of like liability caused by AI, you can create an analogy between liability caused by electricity. Because it's just a technology, it's just a tool in a way, and it's a bit case-by-case basis in that sense.
Alessandro?
Yeah, these two topics are strictly related, and there is a debate on regulating AI, so focusing on liability. And we have two big frameworks. The big framework that is still existing is product liability. What is the problem? Like in the previous presentation about data protection, product liability was creating a different kind of system in which the role of the different actors was quite clear. Now if I create a robot and provide a robot to the user, and the robot is able to learn from the user who is liable. And as you mentioned, it's very important to track the different action of the robots, of the system. Of course, this, on the other side, creates an increasing number of information collected, and so we have some issue in data protection. So on one hand, we have a series of rules about product liability can be applied. and in a certain manner can define the liability of the different actors, that all the actors can be involved more or less, the producer, the user, the developers, and then depends the internal relationship. Another, from my perspective, strange approach is based on the idea that we have to recognize agency to artificial intelligence tools and ask for a liability of artificial intelligence. I think this is very difficult and against the existing framework and difficult to create. Last words about insurance. I think that is a sector in which insurance companies are interested to invest, and under certain conditions it depends, because artificial intelligence has a wide range of applications, but when applications are a list of damages that is more predictable, I think that insurance are a good answer to this level of uncertainty. Thanks.
Just to quickly throw in my 5 cents, I might say something controversial, might rock the boat, but well, to answer the question about the insuring AI, I think Meeri was just right that doesn't exist right now. The conversation is being had, and I think once we get to a point where there's a bit more predictability to it, then I think that'll be a very, very big industry within risk management, within insurance. But just in terms of liability and thinking of responsibility and accountability within that, I know personally, I would think, if, just food for thought, maybe if company executives or higher level decision makers were actually held to account for liability for damage caused by AI, let's say, I imagine there would suddenly be a very, very big drive and interest to make sure that we get these things right when these decision makers are having their necks on the line.
You really make it dangerous to be CEO, because there's a whole lot of corporate responsibility
I know,
type
like
things.
I said, it was a controversial thing.
But I think this is happening at the moment. This whole discussion, actually we should thank Cambridge Analytica and Facebook for bringing up, because this whole discussion has gone really, really big, like after these cases and what you mentioned that these are quite powerful in taking forwards the important discussion. But I think this is namely happening because it's not the data scientists who actually are then accountable or responsible on the consequences that happen. It's the business leader who owns that department or in the business, and now this discussion has actually taken these topics into those people's tables and agendas, and there is a lot of discussion and thinking with those CDOs and business leaders that, okay, do I know what is a portfolio of algorithms that we are handling? Do I have any idea how do these systems work and what are the possible consequences? So that's where the accountability lies, and that's a very powerful way of then there will be actions when these people actually start to ask these questions and drive it in the...
So we started to get into these questions, but I put them up to, what if the government isn't functioning or if the data is dangerous? And who should supervise AI and how it complies with law and soft law? So we have some ideas out there around who should be responsible amongst the people who created it. But is there a particular party on the other side? Is it the same people who are doing data protection regulation? Should we be leaving it to the courts? Maybe it's commercial pressures. What bodies actually practically can act on these principles and create that accountability?
I try. Okay, it depends also by the context, because we speak in general about government and artificial intelligence. As you know, there are different governments and different legal framework. If there is an adequate legal framework in terms of independence of supervisor and so on, the only issues that we have, and it's not minor issues, is the fact that artificial intelligence is something that touches different areas. And so who is the supervisor authority that can act? There are data protection authority, competition authority, non-discrimination authorities, transportation authorities. It depends. And from a political perspective and also regulatory perspective that are strictly related, no one of these authorities want to reduce its power in favor of another authority. So I think that we have to invest in instruments of cooperation. Cooperation not only in the investigation, but also in the sanctioning. And this is the more difficult part, because different authorities can make a joint investigation, but then the sanctioning power is on each authority. So in this sense, the framework, the legal framework, should probably change a bit.
Based on the work that I've been doing, and we have been doing on the public sector, I've been really thinking about this, that first of all, we need this oversight in Finland for the public sector algorithms use. We need it wider, like not only Finland, but like everywhere. And who should be the authority? I was thinking about the new Office for Digital, what is Digivirasto in English? I don't know, but there is this VRK who will have this new role. Like, should it be that one? But that's not independent. It doesn't make any sense in my opinion. So I've been thinking it, and I think this is very close to data protection. So like quite natural would be that these would be new responsibilities for the data protection officer. But this is a discussion that we need to have on a national level, but I think it's really important to find one party who does that so that it's efficient. It doesn't make any sense to split it like all over.
So I've got one fascinating question that just came in. It's going to be the last one, and I'm going to ask each of you to respond. First, yes, no, and then if yes, then which? Should particular data sets by default be excluded from algorithm training or algorithmic training? Give you a second to think about it. All right, we'll start with you, Alessandro, because you're nodding your head.
No, yes, there are data sets that should be excluded.
Which ones?
All the data that are illicit by definition. So you cannot use data also for legitimate purpose that originally are or illegal in the origin or illegal in the content.
So if Facebook acquired a data set and we then determined that it was acquired inappropriately because it didn't have the data protection, then the AI that was developed on that should be considered equally legitimate.
Yeah, and also if you collect data through illegitimate surveillance system or data, for instance, regarding minors or violence and so on, of course, you cannot use this to train algorithm.
Nishan?
Can I use the consultant's answer and say it depends? I would say no, but with your provisos. So as long as that those data sets are being used appropriately and not misused, for want of a better term, then I would agree. Because I think the minute you start perhaps using particular data sets for certain types of training, you start introducing biases, and then it's a slippery slope.
Meeri?
I don't know if I have anything to add to this other than like referring to Oz's good question on does this whole discussion hinder innovation? I hope it does, because some part of the innovation should be hindered. so that's the whole purpose of the governance. So referring to this one, data supply chain is extremely important, and we need this transparency and understanding how the data was sourced for these purposes. And you cannot have ethical AI if you have criminal data sourcing for that.
So we've come full circle. I want to ask, is there any possibility to put the poll we had earlier back up again and clear the answers? The folks over there are going to try and do that while Oz answers. And if yes, then we can redo the question after this discussion. So Oz, what do you think?
I would say yes, and more importantly, certain attributes from some data sets should be excluded. A quick example, let's say credit loan scoring. Obviously, you can use your income, your this and that for training an algorithm, but your race should be excluded from that decision.
Yeah, if we go into details, there are different kinds. Also some images regarding crimes can be in a specific context or be legitimate, but the idea, I think, is knowing the sources and have a check if the sources is in line with the constraints.